A man is standing in a New York post office in 1897, and in about 90 seconds he is going to watch something he will spend the rest of his life unable to explain. His name is Howard Wallace Connolly. He is a postal supervisor, not a dreamer, not a promoter, just a man who has spent his life around mail. And in a moment, a metal cylinder is going to come roaring out of a tube in the wall, someone is going to unscrew the lid, and a live cat is going to climb out. Alive. After being fired through iron pipe, under the streets, around corners, at 30 miles an hour. 34 years later, Connolly will write about that cat in his memoir. And even then, with all that time to think it over, the best he can manage is this. He cannot conceive how it survived. But it did. Hold that image, because two questions sit underneath it, and neither one gets answered quickly. First, how does a living animal survive being shot through miles of pipe like that? And why would anyone do it on purpose? And second, the stranger one. The machine Connolly is watching work flawlessly that day is still under the streets of New York. It was never torn out. It was sealed. And you don't usually seal something that works. Let's start with the cat, because the cat is the part everyone remembers, and almost everyone remembers it wrong. The record shows that when New York's pneumatic mail system was opened, there was a ceremony on the 7th of October, 1897. A senator named Chauncey Depew acted as master of ceremonies. The very first canister sent through carried a Bible wrapped in an American flag, a copy of the Constitution, and a copy of President McKinley's inaugural address. Solemn, patriotic, exactly what you'd expect for the launch of a great civic machine. And then the second canister came through with a cat in it. That part is well documented. After the cat came a suit of clothes, an artificial peach in a basket, and according to the official who wrote it up afterward, 2 magnum bottles of champagne. A government report, an actual federal report, lists a live cat in a cotton sack among the items the system carried successfully. That is the tone of the whole thing. This was not an accident or a prank by a bored clerk. This was the demonstration. This was the pitch. And here's the part that reframes the stunt. The absurdity was the strategy. Because in 1897, you could not simply tell a city that a tube in the wall would move its mail. You had to make people believe a sealed pipe could swallow anything you fed it and deliver it across town, fast and intact. A stack of letters doesn't prove that. A stack of letters is boring. But a cat that goes in one end and walks out the other, dazed, furious, and unmistakably alive, that proves it in a way no chart ever could. The cat wasn't the joke. The cat was the argument. So the surface is a circus trick, but underneath is a very deliberate act of persuasion aimed at a public that needed convincing. And it worked, which brings the obvious next question. Convincing them to use what? Exactly? What did this thing actually do once the cat was out of the sack and the champagne was gone? Here's where the story quietly stops being charming and starts being serious. The record shows that a single canister in the New York system carried somewhere between 400 and 600 letters at a time. The carriers moved at around 30 miles an hour. Some sources say up to 35. And at its peak the network was pushing roughly 95,000 letters a day beneath the streets. 95,000. That figure works out to about 30% of all the mail moving through New York City. Nearly a third of a city's correspondence. Contracts, court papers, love letters, ruin and rescue. Traveling not on the road, not in a wagon, but under the sidewalk, in the dark, at the speed of a galloping horse that never tires and never stops for traffic. A letter could cross Manhattan in minutes. From the main post office up to Harlem. A trip that would punish a horse and cart for the better part of an hour. Took about 20 minutes through the tube. And a line ran under the Brooklyn Bridge, so a canister could leave one borough and surface in another in the time it takes to read this sentence a few times over. At its height, the network reached more than 20 post offices across the city, run as paired tubes, one for each direction, which is why you'll sometimes hear it called a 27-mile system and sometimes a 56-mile one. Both are right. 27 miles of route. More than 50 miles of actual pipe, threaded through the ground under a living city. Sit with the scale of that for a second, because we've been trained to think of this as quaint. It is not quaint. This is a city that built itself a physical internet out of iron and compressed air, and then ran a third of its daily information through it, every working day for decades. People walked over it without knowing it was there. It made no noise they could hear. It just moved, quietly, constantly, underneath everything. And that's the thing hiding in the numbers. We tend to file old technology under primitive. But there was nothing primitive about moving 30% of a metropolis's mail at 30 miles an hour with no engine on the road and no driver to pay. By some measures, this was faster, across the dense core of the city, than anything that replaced it for years afterward. The thing we sealed up was not a failure waiting to happen. It was working. That's the detail to hold on to. It was working. It was also, and this rarely makes the cheerful version, genuinely dangerous. On the 15th of February, 1903, a repair crew dug down to a cracked section of tube under 4th Avenue. Before they were clear of it, a test canister was sent through, and the damaged pipe ruptured under pressure. One worker was killed. Others were hurt. That is not a detail to dramatize. It's a detail to respect, because it tells you exactly how seriously this system was taken. You do not send men underground to keep something running, and keep expanding it after it has killed one of them for a novelty. You do that for something a city has come to depend on. So that's New York. And if this were only New York, it would be a local curiosity, a strange chapter under one city. But that's only the surface. Because the truly unsettling thing about these tubes is not that New York had them. It's that almost everyone had them. The record here is wide, and it is consistent. Before New York ever fired a canister, Philadelphia had a working pneumatic mail line, tested in 1893. Boston, Chicago, and St. Louis followed. By around 1915, 6 American cities together had more than 50 miles of tube pulsing under their streets. And across the Atlantic, the same idea had already taken deeper root. London had experimented with pneumatic dispatch in the mid-1800s. Berlin ran a network. Vienna ran one. And Paris built something that makes New York's system look modest. The Paris pneumatic post began with an experimental line in 1866, grew into its first official line in 1868, and opened to the public in 1879. At its height, in the 1930s, it had grown to over 400 kilometers of pipe, more than 260 miles, feeding around 130 offices across the city. Parisians wrote their messages on little blue cards, the petit bleu, folded and sealed, and dropped them into a system that could carry a note clear across the capital and into a courier's hand within the hour. In 1945 alone, the network carried something like 30 million messages. 30 million. This was not a demonstration with a cat. This was the nervous system of a great city, running for the better part of a century. And here is the part that should make the hair on your arm stand up a little. They all arrived at the same answer. Different countries, different governments, different decades, and yet city after city, independently, reached for the same underground solution to the same problem. The press of the era even had a name for it. They called it the pneumatic age. Not a metaphor. A recognized stage of how modern cities were expected to work. For a stretch of history most of us were never taught about, the assumption was that a serious city moved its urgent information the way New York and Paris did, sealed in a capsule, underground at speed. We don't remember the pneumatic age. But it happened, it was documented, and it was everywhere. Which raises the only question that really matters. If this was so widespread, so useful, so deeply woven into how cities functioned, where did it go? What happens to a global standard? The answer is the part one find hardest to sit with because it isn't a failure. It's a decision. On the 31st of December, 1953, New York's Postal Service shut its pneumatic system down. The official language survives, and it is worth hearing exactly. The service was declared obsolete, unnecessary, and excessively expensive. 3 words doing an enormous amount of work. And then the tubes, the iron veins that had carried a third of the city's mail, were simply left where they lay. Not excavated, not repurposed, sealed, and abandoned in place. To this day, miles of that network still run beneath Lower Manhattan, beneath Midtown, beneath the Brooklyn Bridge. Empty, intact, waiting for a canister that is never coming. Now hold that word, obsolete, against what happened somewhere else because the comparison is where the record turns strange. In Prague, they built almost exactly the same kind of system. It entered public service in 1889, Steel pipe under the old city, capsules driven by compressed air, the same Victorian idea. And Prague did not shut its system down in the 1950s, or the 60s, or the 70s. It kept running. Into the 1990s, in a world of fax machines and early email, the Prague tubes were still carrying messages for banks, for government offices, for the media, roughly 55 kilometers of pipe kept alive in part simply as a point of pride. It became known as the last preserved municipal pneumatic post in the world. The last one still standing. And it did not die because it was obsolete. It died because in August of 2002, a catastrophic flood swept through the city and drowned its engine rooms. 5 of 11 of them, underwater. And machinery that had run for over a century finally went silent. A local businessman bought the whole network in 2011, promising to bring it back. More than a decade later, it still sits down there, preserved and silent. Think about what that means side by side. Same technology, same era of invention. One city called it obsolete and killed it in a single day in 1953. Another kept the identical idea alive and working for another half-century until a flood, not obsolescence, a flood, finally took it out, which tells you that obsolete was never a fact about the tubes. It was a verdict, a choice, made by particular people for reasons of cost and convenience and the pull of newer things. Motor trucks, the telephone, the telex, the fax. The pipe didn't stop working. Someone decided to stop using it, and then decided it wasn't worth the trouble of removing. And so it stayed. It's staying still. I want to be clear about what I am, and am not saying, because the temptation with a story like this is to reach for something hidden, a conspiracy, a suppression, a secret. There isn't one, and the truth doesn't need one. What the record actually supports is stranger and quieter than any plot. That we build a fast, silent, city-spanning way of moving information under our own feet. That we built it in city after city until it was simply how the modern world was assumed to work, and that when we walked away from it, we mostly didn't tear it out. We closed the lid and let the ground swallow the memory. The infrastructure of the pneumatic age is not gone. It is under the pavement, and most of the people walking over it have no idea it was ever there at all. Which brings us back, at the end, to a man standing in a post office in 1897, watching a cat that should not be alive climb out of a tube in the wall. Howard Wallace Connolly saw the whole arc. If you think about it, he saw the day it was a miracle. He saw the years it was ordinary. And he lived long enough to write it all down before the day someone decided it was nothing at all. He never could explain the cat. And there's something fitting in that, because the thing he was standing next to was harder to explain than he knew. A machine so good at its job that a city ran a third of its life through it, and then buried it, gently, still working in the dark under the street. The tubes are still down there. Connolly is gone, and the cat is long gone, and the men who signed the order calling it obsolete are gone. But the pipe remains, sealed at both ends, holding a column of still air that hasn't moved since 1953. And no one has ever quite decided what to do with it. Perhaps because, somewhere underneath the word obsolete, a part of us still isn't sure it deserved to be sealed at all.